They said my lake was a flood risk and drained it without even asking. Thought they were doing the neighborhood a favor. But that lake? It was holding the ground together. Without it, the soil shifted, and now their million-dollar homes are cracking, sinking, sliding downhill. If they can take your land, your water, and call it safety, what's next? That lake wasn't just a pretty backdrop or some landscaping accessory. It was a living, breathing system. It balanced the soil, fed the ecosystem, and kept the ground beneath all of us firm. But the HOA didn't see that. They saw a mirror for their paranoia, a shallow excuse to flex their control. They thought my lake was the risk, thought I was being reckless for defending it. But when they drained it, when they disrupted the very thing holding their foundations together, they didn't just ruin my sanctuary. They doomed themselves. Now, it's not my land that's at risk, it's theirs. Cracked walls, sinking patios, flooded basements. Their million-dollar homes are collapsing under the weight of their own ignorance. They try to fix a problem that didn't exist. And in doing so, they created one they can't undo. That I grew up on this land. I knew every sound it made. The quiet whisper of the reeds in the morning breeze, the bullfrogs croaking under a full moon, the slow, contented lapping of the lake's water against the stone shore after a summer storm. My father called it the heart of the valley, this little natural lake tucked between the trees and hills, half hidden behind groves of pecans and wild cottonwood. It wasn't big, barely 6 acres across, but it was alive, always alive. For decades, it had been the quiet soul of our family's property. My dad kept the lake clean, never dammed it, never altered its flow. We left it wild but cared for, monitored the levels, maintained the outflow, and respected its cycles. When I inherited the place after he passed, I promised I'd do the same. And for the first few years, I did. Morning fishing with coffee in hand, watching otters slide off the banks, turtles sunbathing like they owned the place. Nothing ever felt more peaceful. Then the developers came. At first, it was just survey markers and trucks poking around the far ridge. Then came the heavy machines, the flattened trees, the cut roads. Within 18 months, a new neighborhood stood at the edge of my land, a self-declared lakeside luxury community with signs boasting smart homes, walking paths, and exclusive water view living. I didn't have much of a say. The land sold years earlier by a distant cousin. My family only owned our side of the lake. But the HOA that rose up in those manicured cul-de-sacs sure acted like they owned the whole thing. That was when the letters started. The first one was polite enough, a request for cooperation. They wanted to meet to discuss shared stewardship of the water line and make sure everything was safe and up to regulation. I went, thinking maybe we could work together. I even brought out copies of the environmental reports my father had kept, records going back 25 years showing the lake's flow, depth, and seasonal variations. But they weren't interested in history. They were interested in control. Their president, a man named Greg Hensley, all pressed shirts and artificial smiles, told me their engineers were concerned about potential overflow events due to unregulated body of water proximity. He tossed around terms like urban runoff risk and soil liquefaction during high precipitation cycles. But when I asked for specific cases, data, anything beyond buzzwords, he said the committee was still reviewing internal findings. In truth, there had never been a flood. Not in my lifetime. Not in my father's. The lake had natural inlets and outflows. It rose during the spring rains and fell in summer, but it never spilled over. My own barn sat 30 feet from the edge, untouched by decades of storms. I brought in a hydrologist, independent, certified, objective. She ran her tests, mapped the soil, tested the water levels against seasonal averages. Her report was clear. No evidence of flood hazard or increased risk to adjacent structures. Natural retention functions performing as expected. No drainage modifications recommended. I gave a copy to the HOA. Greg skimmed it and smiled like I'd handed him a grocery receipt. "Thanks, we'll consider it," he said. 2 months later, the real trouble began. One afternoon, I came home and found surveyors pacing along the western shore, on my side. They wore safety vests and carried tablets. When I asked who they were with, one mumbled municipal compliance, then quickly left. That week, I got a notice from the County Water Board stating that a formal review of the lake had been initiated due to flood concerns filed by adjacent residential governing bodies. The HOA had gone over my head. They filed a complaint with the county, citing outdated FEMA floodplain maps and cherry-picked language from a half-finished infrastructure report. They argued that my lake was an unregulated water reservoir that posed clear threat to residential safety and could impact structural integrity of perimeter properties. It was ridiculous. It was dishonest. And it was enough to start a review process I had no power to stop. I appealed. I submitted my expert report. I pleaded with the water board, explained the ecosystem, showed them 20 years of records and 100 photos of flood-free years. But the HOA sent their own experts, paid engineers with vague credentials and thick binders. Greg even got one of the board members to speak at the county meeting in tears, describing how her children were afraid of the lake and how her backyard had once felt damp. The vote passed 3-2. They gave approval to partially drain and divert the lake, to mitigate flood risk and minimize community liability. I was told it would be temporary, just enough to ease water pressure. They said they'd leave the structure and flow intact. But the next week, backhoes rolled in and gouged a trench through the southern ridge. Within 3 days, half the lake was gone. The turtles left first. Then the herons stopped coming. The reeds browned and curled. My morning coffee felt like a funeral. What used to be a glassy mirror turned into a mudflat dotted with trash and tire tracks. But the worst came 2 weeks later, when the trench workers went deeper than authorized, or maybe that had always been the plan. They severed the bedrock flow and dropped the lake below its equilibrium level. Within 5 days, the entire basin dried. Gone. Every fish, every frog, every shimmer of morning light across the water. Gone. I stood there at dawn one morning, boots sinking into cracked clay, and felt something in my chest twist and hollow out. My father had spent his final years tending this lake like a living thing, and now it lay dead at my feet. Not because of drought or disaster, but because a few entitled people didn't want their backyard views disrupted by the idea of nature doing what nature does. They drained the lake in the name of safety, but what they really wanted was control, order, a cleaner reflection for their property values. At first, I was heartbroken. Then I got angry, because 2 weeks later, I started noticing something strange. The air around their homes smelled mustier. Lawns didn't drain like they used to. A neighbor down the ridge mentioned that his basement had flooded. First time it's ever happened, he told me, shaking his head. Another homeowner called me at dusk, a soft-spoken woman who had once asked to paint by the lake. "Have you noticed any cracks in your foundation?" she asked nervously. "Because I'm seeing some weird shifts along the back wall, like the ground's changing underneath us." That's when the pieces clicked. Draining the lake hadn't solved a problem. It had created one. And maybe, just maybe it was about to solve mine. At first, I thought it was just paranoia. When the lake dried up and the HOA called it a successful mitigation effort, I assumed they were just smug with power. But when the land started changing, sinking, shifting, cracking, I knew something was wrong. Something deeper. Something they either hadn't anticipated or had planned all along. I started paying attention. Closer attention. I visited the county records office under the pretense of requesting new zoning maps. What I really wanted were permits, anything tied to the lake or the adjacent land since the HOA's formation. It took hours, but the search paid off. Buried in the permit filings were 3 separate requests filed by the HOA board over the last 18 months. The language was vague: terrain stabilization studies, drainage infrastructure forecasting, future development exploration. But the locations? They all border the lake. And all 3 were signed by the same 2 names: Greg Hensley, HOA president, and Eliza Carver, who I later learned was not only a board member, but also a licensed real estate developer. That was my first real clue. I dug deeper, pulled property tax records. A few LLC names popped up, tied to undeveloped parcels on the far east side of the drained lake bed. One of them, Hollowstone Ventures, was linked to a P.O. box that matched Eliza's business registration. Another, Shelter Ridge Group, had Greg's name buried 2 layers down in corporate filings. That was no coincidence. They hadn't drained the lake to protect homes. They drained it to open land, to convert previously inaccessible or unusable lakefront space into sellable, buildable lots. In one sweep, they killed a natural resource and inflated their property reach, under the flag of community safety. I felt sick. That lake had taken generations to stabilize. Its ecosystem had balanced through droughts and floods, its water tables rising and falling like breath. Now it was a dead scar in the dirt, and it wasn't just nature that was hurting. The first structural complaint came from Harold Winthrop, a retired Air Force mechanic who'd moved into the HOA's Ridge home 3 years earlier. We'd never spoken much, but after hearing rumors that my land was shifting again, he knocked on my door. "My patio's sinking," he said flatly. 3 inches in a week. "Did you report it?" I asked. He snorted. "To Greg? He told me it's my sprinkler system. I don't even own sprinklers." I asked if I could see it. He let me in. There, clear as day, the flagstones on his rear patio were tilting backward, and small vertical cracks were beginning to form where the brick wall met the concrete. One look and I knew. The ground wasn't draining. It was saturating. Groundwater was pushing upward, water that used to be caught, slowed, and balanced by the lake. I took pictures. He didn't protest. Over the next 2 weeks, more neighbors reached out. Some were quiet about it, slipping letters into my mailbox or calling from burner numbers. Others were angry, not at me, but at themselves for believing the HOA's lies. But not everyone was on my side. Some homeowners began whispering that I had caused this, that my refusal to cooperate had somehow triggered the HOA's necessary action, that the lake had been dangerous all along, and I was just bitter over losing control. The community was splitting, some grasping for truth, others clinging to the safety of the official story. The HOA only fanned the flames. A new flyer circulated on doorsteps, this time with bolder language. "Don't let one man destroy our progress." The lake was a threat. Its removal protects us all. Attempts to reverse this progress are dangerous and selfish. Community unity is our strength. It was unsigned, but everyone knew where it came from. And just like that, I became the villain, the reckless landowner, the stubborn recluse who had let things get out of control. Then came a lawsuit threat. I received a certified letter from a law firm representing the HOA. It accused me of spreading misinformation, interfering with community safety initiatives, and damaging property values through hostile rhetoric and public speculation. They demanded I stop unauthorized investigations, cease harassment of residents, and refrain from making future defamatory statements regarding the board. I held the letter in my hand for a long while, then laughed out loud, because now I knew I had them scared. I took the letter straight to Sarah Benton, a local environmental attorney who'd worked on wetland restoration cases across the state. She reviewed the files I had gathered, the drained lake photos, the land records, the HOA's own filings, and the notices from affected homeowners. "This isn't just mismanagement," she said, flipping through the papers. "This is fraud disguised as community policy. If we can link their development intentions to the lake's destruction, they're cooked." I nodded. "I'm not trying to sue. I just want the truth known. I want it fixed." Sarah leaned back. "Then we build the case. Quietly. No press. Not yet." Together, we drafted requests for public records under the state's transparency laws. We submitted formal inquiries to the Water Board for communications tied to the HOA's complaints. We filed environmental access requests for soil tests across the HOA's slope-facing properties. While we waited, I made calls to 2 former city engineers, a retired hydrogeologist, and a nonprofit focused on environmental justice. Slowly, a picture formed. The lake hadn't just buffered floodwater. It had anchored the entire area's water table, removing its unbalanced subsurface flow, which began to shift toward the nearest low-pressure zones, the basements and foundations of HOA homes. And worse, the land Greg and Eliza had claimed as buildable was now classified as high-risk shifting terrain. Their own surveyor had flagged it in 2017, but buried the report in a follow-up development-ready file submitted a year later. I had a copy of both. That was the nail. The truth, when it came together, was staggering. The flood risk, claim was built on cherry-picked data from a seasonal high year. Greg and Eliza had positioned themselves to profit directly from draining the lake. The land destabilization was known and ignored. And now, dozens of homes were at risk of sinking into the very ground they claimed to be protecting. I sat on my porch one night, looking out at the dry bowl where the lake used to be. The wind blew dust across the cracked mud like ghosts. It wasn't just about me anymore. This had become something bigger. They tried to erase a lake to gain an edge. But in doing so, they exposed something deeper, something fragile, that no HOA policy could patch back together. And I wasn't going to let them get away with it. If they were going to bury the truth under fake permits and fake concern, then I would dig it out with facts. Clean, sharp, and undeniable. The first person I brought in was Dr. Nolan Ray, an independent hydrologist with 30 years of experience, a no-nonsense attitude, and a habit of tapping his pen against his leg when he was about to say something important. He stood at the edge of what used to be my lake and stared in silence for a long minute. "Jesus," he muttered. "They drained the whole thing." "Every drop," I said. He walked the entire basin, made notes on a pad, drove steel soil probes into the cracked clay, and ran GPS contouring for groundwater flow models. 3 hours later, we sat at my kitchen table while he flipped through the first few pages of data. "They dropped the static water table by at least 4 feet, he said. "More in the southeast corner. You see this?" He pointed at a colorful, shaded map. "That side's slumping, losing internal cohesion. The lake used to hold the subgrade stable, weight balanced against groundwater pressure. Drain the lake, remove the water mass, and suddenly the hydrostatic tension disappears. Groundwater's got nowhere to go but sideways. Or up." He tapped his pen again. "If homes were built on marginal fill or loose topsoil, which, let's be honest, most of these subdivisions are, then it's only a matter of time before you start seeing cracks," I said. He nodded. "Cracks, buckling, wet basements, doors that don't close right, maybe even sinkholes if they hit a pocket. So far, I knew of 5 homes already showing symptoms. But I needed more than anecdotes. I filed public records requests with the county for drainage complaints and service calls within the HOA development. I requested incident reports for structural inspections, permit amendments, and code enforcement tickets for the last 12 months. It took over a week for the documents to come back, but when they did, it was like reading a diagnosis line by line. 5 separate homes had reported basement water intrusions in the last 45 days. 2 had requested county inspections for unusual floor slope development. 1 had begun early litigation with their builder, citing latent foundation instability. The dates all aligned with the lake's drainage timeline. And the best part? None of them had been disclosed by the HOA. They were trying to keep it quiet, hoping each homeowner would deal with it individually, afraid to stir the pot or expose the HOA's misstep. But all it would take was one thread pulled in public and the whole cover-up would unravel. I made a list of insurance companies listed on the open records, each tied to active property claims within the HOA's bounds. I called their regional adjusters directly, introduced myself as an adjacent landowner with hydrologist data and a timeline, and offered my findings as a neighborly courtesy. Adjusters don't care about neighborhood drama. They care about risk, liability. Within days, they were calling me back, asking for maps, coordinates, soil reports. I gave them what they needed, just enough to verify, not enough to alarm. Then I went back to the homeowners. I knocked on Harold Winthrop's door first. "Harold, I've got a hydrologist report and confirmation from the county. The ground's shifting because the lake's gone. I'm documenting everything. Want it?" He didn't even hesitate. "Let's do it." Next, I approached the woman who'd asked about foundation cracks, Diana Roth. She was shaken, unsure, but when I showed her that her home had been marked as a development buffer zone in HOA planning documents 2 years prior, she signed the affidavit. Then came Tomas and Rena Keller, a young couple who'd only moved into Hillridge 6 months ago. They were already fighting with their builder over a drainage issue. When I showed them satellite images of the lake's decline and matched it with their first basement flooding report, Tomas exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "Whatever this becomes," he said, "we're in." I was careful, quiet, no press, No social media posts, no flyers. Just private conversations. Testimonies signed and notarized. Photos dated and stored in multiple locations. I began logging shifts in elevation using a borrowed topography scanner, marking where the land had visibly sloped by more than a degree. And all the while, I kept feeding data, trickle by trickle, to the people who could do something about it. Insurance companies, county inspectors, environmental watchdogs. It wasn't just about proving the HOA had lied. It was about showing the impact, the cost of their actions. One rainy afternoon, Dr. Ray came back with updated subsurface flow maps. "This is the most alarming part," he said, pointing to the blue overlay creeping toward the base of the HOA's inner circle. Without the lake acting as a retention zone, rainwater now saturates into the slope beneath the homes. The soil underneath is slowly becoming hydroplastic, meaning they're sitting on a sponge. And sponges shift. At that point, I reached out to the county's chief property assessor under the pretense of verifying boundary valuations. I showed him the new drainage data, the open claims, the HOA's unreported development plans. He stared at the documents, frowning. "If this is true, home values in that area are grossly overestimated. They're about to collapse," I said. He blinked. "Is the HOA aware?" "I'd be surprised if they weren't. But they're not telling anyone." A few days later, I heard that at least 2 homes had been quietly listed for sale, below market value. No mention of subsidence issues. No disclosure of prior flooding. That's fraud. And the walls were closing in. By now, I had 7 homeowners on board for expert statements, 2 full hydrologist reports, and a soil survey that directly linked the structural damage to the removal of the lake. It was time to go public, but not in a newspaper, not in a courtroom, not yet. I wanted the community to see the truth first, with their own eyes. So I planned one last move. I requested speaking time at the next HOA meeting. Technically, any resident or adjacent landowner could request 3 minutes of floor time. They approved me, probably thinking I'd come a bark about ducks or nostalgia again. Instead, I'd bring science, data, and witnesses, because once that microphone turned on, they wouldn't just be looking at a grieving landowner. They'd be looking at the beginning of their end. The meeting was set for 6 p.m. sharp in the Hill Ridge Community Hall, the same pastel-painted room where, less than a year ago, the HOA voted unanimously to support the lake drainage initiative as a precautionary flood defense. Now, it was standing room only, and not for the reasons Greg Hensley and the board had hoped. People were angry, tired, quiet at first, but that was always the tone before a storm. Outside, the lawns of several luxury homes showed signs of stress. Where there were once manicured slopes and retaining walls, there were now uneven patches of earth and hairline cracks running across freshly poured concrete. You could feel the ground's confusion beneath your boots. The homeowners had noticed, and this time they wanted answers. Greg took the microphone first, pale and tight-lipped. "We want to thank everyone for coming," he began, his voice flatter than usual. "We've received concerns regarding property shifts and minor foundation irregularities. Our engineering consultant has assured us these changes are within expected parameters." A woman in the 3rd row stood and shook a photo in the air. "My porch collapsed last Tuesday," she said. "Is that expected?" Whispers rose through the crowd. Greg glanced at his fellow board members, none of whom made eye contact. He cleared his throat. "We're currently coordinating with county officials to assess long-term solutions. Please allow the board time to—" "Time's up," I said, stepping forward. All eyes turned. I wasn't wearing anything special. Jeans, a black collar shirt, a folder in one hand, but in the other, a rolled-up series of maps and stamped documents, the kind that don't need flair to have weight. "Mr. Whitmore," Greg said, blinking, "you weren't scheduled. I filed for speaking time last week. Got confirmation from Lydia, your assistant. I'm sure the room won't mind giving me a few minutes." The audience didn't object. I walked to the front of the hall and laid my materials on the same podium where Greg stood. He stepped aside, reluctantly. I turned to the crowd and took a slow breath. "My name's Jacob Whitmore. I own the property adjacent to what used to be your lake, the one this HOA petitioned to drain, citing a flood risk that never existed. I'm here to share what really happened and what it's costing every one of you. I unrolled the topographic map, the color-coded flow chart produced by Dr. Nolan Ray. The hydrologist's credentials were printed on the bottom in bold. This, I continued, shows groundwater flow beneath the development before the lake was drained. The water pressure was evenly distributed, naturally balanced by retention from the lake's basin. Now, I slapped down a second map. After the drainage trench was dug, that balance is gone. There's no cap, no resistance. The water table shifted. Guess where it moved? I tapped a blue crescent that hugged the back end of Hill Ridge's eastern homes. Beneath your foundations. Several people gasped. One man stood abruptly, looking at the map as if it had called his name. But our drainage system was updated last year, someone near the board said. That was supposed to help. I nodded. It would have helped if your board hadn't bypassed the required geotechnical evaluation when they pushed the drainage approval through. I got those filings too. I held up stamped copies of the county review timeline. No full study, no second-party approval, just HOA pressure and selective data pulled from outdated FEMA reports. Greg interjected, "You're speculating. We followed every legal." "No, you didn't," I said, louder now. "You hid the development filings. I have property claims linked to 2 HOA board members tied to construction LLCs that filed applications for lakeside expansion lots just days after the drainage vote passed. That's not speculation. That's motive." I looked out at the crowd, and the weight of the truth settled into the silence like a dropped anvil. Here's the part you all need to understand. The very homes you thought were being protected are now being undermined from beneath. Literally. Dr. Ray's report, peer-reviewed and submitted to the county, shows structural destabilization due to the groundwater shift. And the worst part, I held up another page, this one printed in thick black type. Your insurance companies know. They've begun reviewing claims. Some of you have already gotten the letters, or you will soon. They're labeling the damage as willful environmental interference, which means I'll let the question hang. No payout, someone whispered. Correct, I said. They don't have to cover it, because the problem wasn't an act of God. It was an act of ignorance, one done in full view of warnings. There was shouting now, not at me, at the board. Greg raised his hands. Let's stay calm, everyone. This is still unconfirmed. Then explain this, I said, and held up the affidavit from Diana Roth, whose foundation had split in two. She reported her concerns months ago. You told her it was cosmetic. She now has $43,000 in repairs and no insurance payout. You lied, and now you're trying to cover it up. The room was coming alive. People shouting over each other. Voices rising. Greg's face turned red. One board member simply got up and walked out. Another began packing papers with shaking hands. I turned back to the audience, raising my voice over the din. You deserve better. Not just better answers, but better leadership. And right now, you're standing on homes that are sinking because someone decided their profit was worth more than your property lines. A woman in the front row stood. What can we do? I paused, then said, start with accountability. Demand a third-party audit. Demand public release of every document tied to the drainage vote. And if they won't, give it. I dropped a flash drive on the table. I already have them. That was when the sheriff walked in, not to escort me out, but to deliver a notice. I didn't know he'd come tonight, but I wasn't surprised. He stepped forward and handed Greg a sealed envelope. This is from the county zoning board, he announced. Effective immediately, Hill Ridge HOA's authority is suspended, pending an investigation into unlawful environmental interference and permit manipulation. Silence again. Total. And then applause. One by one, people clapped, then stood. Not for me, but for themselves. For truth finally pulled into the light after months of silence and manipulation. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just gathered my things, nodded once, and walked out into the night air. Behind me, their million-dollar homes sat on compromised ground, their hollow leadership falling apart faster than the soil beneath their feet. They drained the lake thinking it would protect them. But nature doesn't follow votes, and justice doesn't stay buried forever. IT took less than a week for the first resignation to land. Greg Hensley stepped down with a thin, one-page statement mailed out in plain envelopes. Due to personal matters and ongoing investigations, I will no longer be serving as HOA president. No apology, no admission, just an exit. By the end of the month, 2 more board members followed, and by then, lawsuits had already been filed by at least 6 homeowners. Some were small claims for foundation repair reimbursements. Others were class action filings targeting the HOA's board for negligence and fraud. The community that once stood silent was now speaking loudly, with legal backing and receipts. But the real victory wasn't in the fallout. It was in what came next. When the dust began to settle, and the HOA's authority was temporarily placed under county review, the residents voted to form a transitional advisory committee. I didn't ask to be part of it, but they asked me. I accepted, cautiously at first. I'd spent so long on the outside of that room, pushing against its walls, that stepping inside felt strange. But this time, the air was different. There were no closed doors, no rubber stamps, just neighbors, some embarrassed, some relieved, finally ready to do the work. With the county's cooperation, the advisory board passed a motion to revisit land use policy around the lake bed. What had once been declared excess runoff space was now reclassified as a protected ecological buffer zone. And the restoration? They gave it to me. Well, not to me exactly. They granted stewardship rights to a new organization I helped found called Lakewood Trust, a community-led conservation nonprofit. Its mission, to restore the lake, revive its surrounding wetlands, and turn the space into a shared sanctuary. What was once drained in secrecy would now be rebuilt in full view, tree by tree, reed by reed. We didn't aim for a complete man-made reservoir. That wouldn't have honored the land's natural design. Instead, we constructed a graduated wetland basin with filtered flow channels, allowing seasonal water to collect and cycle without threat. Native plants returned. Frogs returned. Turtles found their way home, as if they had just been waiting for someone to open the door. Children now walk along the gravel trails that wind around the edge of the basin. There's a sign at the front. Welcome to Hollow Lake Preserve, a community rooted in resilience. Some Saturdays, I lead walking tours, part history, part ecology, part cautionary tale. I tell the truth, not to shame, but to educate. We talk about balance, about how nature isn't just a backdrop to development. It is development, the oldest kind. And the people listen, even those who once sat on the other side. Diana Roth joined the board's environmental subcommittee. Tomas Keller now leads community cleanup days. And Harold? He helped me build a new overlook platform using recycled decking from his damaged patio. We laughed about it as we screwed in the last board. Poetic, huh? He said. Yeah, poetic. The lake isn't just a body of water anymore. It's a mirror, a reflection of what this place became when truth was louder than fear. When the new HOA elections came around, I didn't run. They offered me a seat anyway, honorary, non-voting. I took it, not for power, for presence, for perspective, for the quiet reminder that decisions, once made in dark corners, now happen in the open. This land has always spoken, in rustling grass and shifting water. The difference now is we're finally listening. They drained the lake thinking it was a threat. But nature doesn't play politics. It doesn't care about board votes or bylaws, about inflated property values or engineered appearances. It operates on balance, patient, quiet, and precise. And when that balance is disturbed for the sake of control or convenience, nature doesn't lash out, it simply shifts. Silently, inevitably, until the consequences catch up. What they saw as a puddle in the way of progress was really a keystone, holding up far more than just water. It anchored the soil, fed the trees, held the ground firm beneath the homes they built too fast, with too little respect for what lay beneath. But this story isn't just about land. It's about listening. It's about truth, about what happens when silence becomes complicity, and what happens when someone finally says, enough. They tried to erase that lake, tried to bury my voice in legal threats and engineered shame. But they forgot one thing. The land remembers. And in the end, it was not my anger that humbled them. It was the very thing they tried to control, reminding them, With every cracked wall and sinking porch, that balance doesn't ask permission to return. It just does.